Hello everybody, welcome to the first video on this channel. I am doing this as a form of creative outlet and a new medium to express myself. This video was inspired by a teacher at school because she told me to watch this movie, and I watched it, so now I am filming this video. So, the topic for today: a movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito become dads, but not in the most traditional ways. We'll get into that later, but let me just say, this movie was quite surreal. It felt like I was in a fever dream half the time, but that's what made it kind of interesting. For a bit of context, this movie was directed by Ivan Reitman, the guy who directed the original two Ghostbusters movie, which, as we all know, are pinnacle examples of 80s filmmaking.
Batman, what happened? Are you okay?
He slimed me.
That's what she said.
Thinking about the Ghostbusters, it's just like, reminds me of all the early 90s and late 80s kids movies. Now, I'm too young to have actually experienced them when they first came out, but through watching movies on the TV and watching movies at my grandparents' house and old VHS tapes I found laying around, I feel like I've gotten a good feel as to how 80s movies were like. And they feel like they were genuinely for the whole family. To this day, I can still go back and watch movies like The Sandlot and Casper all day. This is, in my opinion, the golden age of kids movies. They all have a certain funky, groovy, and tubular feel to them that just isn't in any movies today. Never mind me. Let's not get on a tangent. I don't want to wake my math calculus teacher. Been asleep for the past 2 weeks, and I kind of don't want to wake him up. I don't want to wake up my math calculus teacher? What the hell type of line is that, bro? I'm sorry, but whose idea? Who let me write that in the script? So where were we? That's right. Talking about how Arnold Schwarzenegger became pregnant in the movie Junior. How could I forget? Such a timeless film. Welcome to my personal movie theater. Seeing as I am merely a PNG of a monkey on the internet being animated for video, I can appear anywhere I want to. Look, here I am at the Eiffel Tower. Here I am at the Great Wall of China. And believe it or not, I'm in space. But to make the job of my editor easier, I am going to stay here in this movie theater. Okay, let's get started on the movie. The movie starts off in a dream where one of our protagonists, Alexander Hess, portrayed by the one and only former governor of California himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger, is in a room of crying children. Sorry, not children, babies, which is arguably worse. Now, this scene is obvious foreshadowing for the Pandora's box that we are about to open by watching this movie. And after that dream, we just see him go by his normal daily routine, which includes some killer ab workouts on his bed. No wonder he won Mr. Universe. Just look at that man's training regime. We then see him go to his lab at the university he works at, where he is developing a chemical named expecting that could potentially solve the problem of miscarriages in pregnant women. From there, we are introduced to the man, the myth, and the legend, Danny DeVito, whose glory is only rivaled by that of gods. In Junior, Dan DeVito plays a gynecologist named Larry Arbogast, who is working in conjunction with Alexander to present the drug to the FDA for approval on human trials for expecting. Unfortunately, at the FDA meeting, we are shown that the human trials for expecting were not approved because it was deemed too dangerous by the board. 1 week later, Larry's ex-wife goes into his office to get checked up because she is pregnant, but to the surprise of Larry, it's not his, but rather some guy she got with after they had gotten separated. In the movie, it's never clearly stated why they got divorced, but it's implied that they are separated because Larry was unable to get her pregnant. And still, she wants him to be her doctor. How thoughtful of her. Seriously, just think about this. She asked her ex, who couldn't get her pregnant, to be her doctor to a pregnancy of another man. He obviously denies her like any sane human would do, but he does recommend her another doctor that she can go with. Their encounter is cut short after that because of a call that Larry receives from Baines, the director of the research division at the university, saying that Alexander has locked himself in his lab because the FDA has turned them down and is terminating the Expectane project. Larry gets to the lab around the same time that Alexander's future love interest in the movie, Deanna Redden, does, because she is there to inhabit the lab that Alexander is being kicked out of. And the reason that Deanna is at the laboratory is because she is working on preserving female eggs through cryogenics. So when she arrives to the lab, she arrives rolling on a giant cooler after falling off the truck it was delivered on. With a pretty flashy introduction between Alexander and Deanna, where they literally kiss within seconds of meeting each other, Deanna both literally and figuratively breaks in her lab. You get the joke? Because like she's breaking in, like she broke. Never mind. After getting frustrated by the eviction from his lab and the termination of all his work, Alexander storms off and plans to leave for another place that will fund his Expectane project. Larry obviously does not want him to leave because he knows that the Expectane is worth a lot of money. So Larry follows Alexander from the university to his house, then from his house to the airport, and literally onto the plane where Alexander was taking off. After hours of pestering Alexander, he was finally convinced. The only thing is, they're gonna have to do it by themselves. There's only one small problem though. Larry convinced Alexander to go back to the experiment on the basis that he already had an anonymous egg from a female donor. Larry did not in fact have an egg to perform the experiment on though. Larry later that night had to sneak into the lab and steal one of the eggs from Deanna's cooler. Little did he know he would steal Deanna's own egg that she produced that she had frozen, which she nicknamed Junior, which is where the title of the movie comes from. After all was said and done, they finally got to the experiment where they inserted the fertilized egg into a cavity in Alexander's abdominal region. This, ladies and gentlemen, is when the movie starts to get a little surreal. The next day after the procedure, Alexander wakes up in Larry's house. Funny enough, sleeping in his ex-wife's room. They do some tests and confirm what we all thought was impossible. Alexander was indeed pregnant.
You may be crazy, but you're also pregnant.
We cut to 4 weeks later when Alexander is finally beginning to feel the effects of motherhood. I can only imagine what mothers and Alexander have to go through, literally creating a human being inside of you. An organic 3D printer if you must. I swear, I actually have to be blacking out for some of these lines that I write in the script. Why did I think that was a good idea? An organic 3D printer? Nah, bro. We also get one of the best interactions in the movie here when Alexander says some very interesting things to Larry.
My nipples are very sensitive. What?
Diana begins to notice something is up with Alexander, but Larry and Alexander just play it off as some rare disease. And obviously she buys it because I think it's fairly reasonable to say of any human that you won't automatically think that a man would be pregnant. So Deanna shoves her concerns under the rug and forgets about it for now. Quickly, the quote-unquote telltale signs of pregnancy start to become very apparent within Alexander. He's watching soap operas, admiring his baby bump, and being overly connected to Larry. Alexander just wants Larry to stay in and be with him because he's been going out late at night. But one day, Alexander does go out with Larry. They go to a ball where some potential investors of Expectane are attending. When they're at the ball, Alexander is eating the portions for 2 humans. But I can't tell if it's because he's pregnant or because of how muscular of a man he is. He just needs to eat that much. But there's some bad news, because while Larry was talking to the investors for Expectane, Baines, the director for the university who had shut down their program, was there at the ball and overheard Larry. Baines even directly asks Larry if there's a woman taking Expectane, which Larry wholeheartedly says the truth and answers no, which is not technically a lie because there is no woman taking Expectane It's only Alexander. Deanna then shows up to the ball, and Alexander is taken aback by her beauty in a dress. Alexander and Deanna dance the night away, until it's finally Alexander's time to go. It was that night, when the experiment became more than just that, because Larry told Alexander that they had all the data they needed to please the investors, and they didn't want any more unwanted attention from Baines, because that could get him in trouble. And Alexander had become too influenced by his pregnancy. So Larry decides to tell Alexander that it's time to stop the experiment and go back to his normal life. At first, Alexander does agree, but then later that night, when he's about to go to sleep, he decides that he wants to keep the child. We then cut to 10 weeks later, when Alexander has a full-blown bowling ball in his stomach. At this point, Larry was unaware that Alexander had continued to take expecting, which is honestly pretty surprising given the fact that for 10 weeks he did not notice Alexander continued to show signs of pregnancy. Larry, obviously concerned for his friend, then took Alexander to the office where he would check how the baby was doing and make sure that everything was okay. While waiting for Larry in the waiting room, Alexander bonded with the other moms and told them how he would name his child Junior. It didn't matter if it was a boy or a girl. When Alexander finally does get the baby checked, everything is perfectly okay and it's healthy. And Alexander beams with joy as he sees the sonogram of his kid. At the university, Baines notices some irregularities in the purchasing orders from the lab that point to a continued manufacturing of the expecting drug, so he decides to look further into it. At home, Alexander is visited by Diana, where she says that she somehow feels a certain connection to him, which then leads to them pursuing that connection in a way that would turn this movie rated for adults. But too bad they're interrupted by Larry's ex, whose name is Angela, by the way, because I haven't said it yet. Diana leaves in embarrassment, and Angela stays and eats dinner with Alexander. And since they're both pregnant, they both eat a interesting array of foods, like ice cream and wings together. Honestly, that sounds like heaven. The next day, Larry and Alexander came back from shopping to find Baines at their doorstep, ready to ask questions, like the nosy little weasel that he is. Baines started snooping around and asked again if they were using expecting, to which both Alexander and Larry answered no. As Baines was heading out, he snuck his way upstairs and found all the expecting that Alexander had been taking for his pregnancy. Baines took a vial to examine and then left. A date with Diana, Alexander and her come up on the topic of baby names, and she mentions how she would have named her child Junior, which is the same name as the egg that was injected into Alexander. He storms off from the date in a rush to find Larry and ask him where the egg was really from. When Alexander finally asks him, Larry admitted to having stolen it from Diana. Back at the university, Baines gets back the results from the vial he stole and confirms for a fact that Alexander is in fact pregnant. Then, in the lab, Alexander meets up with Diana again to apologize for storming off on their date, and he then explains everything and how he is pregnant with her child. That sentence sounds like a typo, but it isn't. That's just the movie it is. Just as she was scolding Alexander, the police and Baines show up at the lab to take Alexander away, seeing as he was technically campus property. In an attempt to defend himself, Alexander threw Baines across the room and then ran away from the police into Larry's car, which was outside because Larry was going to talk to Alexander at the lab. In order to escape this chaos that was ensuing, Larry took Alexander to an expecting mother's retreat, where it was sort of like therapy for all pregnant women there. Larry had to go to a meeting with the investors that would last 2 days, so Alexander would have to bear with pretending to be a woman for 2 days until Larry got back. And just as Larry was closing the deal, Alexander began to go into labor at the resort and locked himself in his room in order to not let anyone see what he was actually like. Larry immediately came back home from the meeting and picked up Alexander and Deanna. And as he was driving, he called ahead to his office and told him to prepare for an emergency C-section in order to birth Alexander's baby. I'm so glad that they chose a C-section, because as I was watching the movie, I was genuinely mortified at the idea that he was going to have to give birth through the other end. That's all I'm going to say. Baines somehow gets wind of what's happening and calls the press to be in front of Larry's office in order to catch the first ever man to give birth. So what Larry does as a diversion is he sends Alexander and Deanna to the back where they can enter through the window, while him and Angela enter through the front and attract all the attention from the press. When the press sees that it's not a pregnant man but rather just an ordinary pregnant woman, they are disappointed and leave. Then Baines is fired for embarrassing the university. As they successfully roll Alexander into the operating room and give birth to his child, Angela also begins to give birth in the waiting room, right after Alexander had given birth. We aren't shown that she gives birth, but we are then later introduced to her son, which obviously her son had to be born, right? So, in the end of this grand adventure, everyone lived happily ever after. Angela and Larry decided to give marriage another shot, and Deanna is now the one pregnant with Alexander's child. Overall, I give this movie 3 X and Y albums over 4 Parachute albums. Interpret that as you wish. Bye. I am so exhausted.